Hey, it's 6 o'clock. I'm going to get us started. My name is Madeline. I'm the Education Program Coordinator at King Conservation District. So I work with all of our teams to put on education events like this one. We also do in-person tours. We have some other webinars and then a couple other events throughout the year. But I have with me today my coworkers on the farm team, Miranda and Megan. So Miranda's helping me with some behind the scene things, and Megan is our presenter today. Um, we do have everyone's microphones disabled, but you're welcome to put all questions in the chat, and we're going to get to those questions at the end of the webinar. If we do run out, if we have so many questions that we run out of time, those remaining questions will get answered in an email tomorrow, where I'm also going to send out a lot of resources and the presentation slides. So if you feel like you're getting a lot of information today, you'll have written materials to refer to in that email tomorrow. I'm also recording the webinar today, and probably later this week or early next week, I'll have that cleaned up and I'll send out an online link to it so that you can revisit the presentation or share it with anybody that you want to. Um, For people who haven't heard of King Conservation District or conservation districts in general, we are special purpose government agencies. So we're non-regulatory. We don't do any enforcement. We don't have anything to do with permits. We are here to make sure that the residents of King County in our service area have access to services to steward the natural resources in their care. So Megan and Miranda are on our farm team, but we also have a riparian team and a forestry team that offers services to people living or working near forests or on waterways. And then we have additional programs like soil testing and our annual native plant sale that anyone can take advantage of. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Megan.
Thanks, Madeline. Hi, everyone. As Madeline said, I'm on the farm team with the Conservation District. But I think pretty much everyone at KCD knows that I love all things pollinator. So I'm so excited to give this presentation tonight. This is our first time giving it. It was the new presentation we've created. So I'm very excited. So the goal of creating this talk was really to provide a resource to the community to promote an appreciation for our native pollinators and to give you ideas on how to best support them. And so the topic of pollinators is vast. There's a lot of different aspects of pollinators that we could talk about, but so for the sake of condensing this subject into an hour, we're going to specifically focus on the species indigenous to our area and ways to support them, focusing on native plants. But there's lots of other talks that are given throughout the area about pollinators. So I definitely encourage you to look at other talks and see the differences and the different topics that other folks present too, because it's a huge topic. I just wanted to mention like my role at the Conservation District is I work with rural cooperators in King County, and I help them steward their land and protect natural resources with a heavy focus on protecting water quality and soil health. But we also help them know how to do pollinator planting habitat and conservation cover. And so this is a fun part of my job. So just to give you an outline of what we're talking about today, we're going to talk a little bit. Madeline already covered a lot about KCD, but we're going to cover a little bit more about who the King Conservation District is, briefly about who our native pollinators are, pollinator impact on the world, thoughts and ways about creating pollinator habitat, and then additional tips to help our pollinators, and some fun examples about pollinator habitat that are local, even more resources to kind of set you on your journey. I kind of want to give you a good foundation with this presentation to then go forth and you can take deep dive and go up in other directions and future learning about pollinators. And then some final thoughts, and then we'll open it up for lots of questions. So the KCD mission, our official mission statement is that we empower people to conserve and enhance soil, water, food systems, forest, and habitat now and for future generations. So you may or may not have heard about conservation districts, but every county in the state has a conservation district, and we're often considered a best kept secret, and most people find out about us through word of mouth. So I highly encourage you to go onto our website, which is kingcd.org, and check out all of the services that we offer. Or if you don't live in the King County, go into your county's conservation district website and see their services. We're very similar, the West Side Conservation District. We all have kind of similar programming, but we have lots of resources there for folks to take advantage of. So, and I'll do even more promoting about some of our programs at the end of this talk. And just to reiterate again, because it's a big point of confusion within King County, but we're a non-regulatory agency or a state agency. And so King County sometimes has a reputation of being regulatory, but we are a safe resource for folks within the district. So then jumping into who are native pollinators, I just want to preface that this is not like a full entomology talk. We're just going to kind of dabble and kind of do a larger 10,000 foot view of who our native pollinators are in the area. But I can also give you references if you want to learn more about the individual species. And then I just wanted to give a photo credit to my coworker, Matt Maria, who provided me with this photo of a painted lady butterfly on a riverbank lupin in his yard. So just in a very broad sense, pollinators are anything that helps move pollen from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of the same or another flower. So it's the movement of pollen from plant to plant to become fertilized and produce seeds and young plants. So that's what we're talking about. You'll probably hear me say the word pollinator about 150 times in this talk today, but that's what I'm referring to. So jumping into our native bees, just for reference, that top picture is one of our green mining bees, and the bottom picture is an alki bee. So there's over 600 species of native bee found in Washington, and they're kind of the primary pollinator that we refer to in a lot of our referencing. Surprisingly, 70% of native bees nest in the ground, and the rest are cavity dwellers. So those big hives that you think of, like in Winnie the Pooh growing up, that's not where our native bees are found. Those are more for like the honeybee that we'll talk about. And solitary bees like mason bees and carpenter bees make up about 90% of our bee species. And mason bees are really robust pollinators. So there's a species you want around for your gardens and your fruit trees and all things flower. Another thing I like to stress is that native bees are generally non-aggressive and even stingless. And they're usually very focused on pollinating, kind of calmly going about their work. And so I wanted to kind of just help dispel a little fear around our native bees. I think yellow jacket hornets are often confused for bees, but they're a separate predatory species. They are aggressive and they will sting you, different from native bees. I have been out in the forested area next to my house, weeding plants right over top of a native bumblebee hive in the ground, and they've come out because I disturbed them. And my arm was right over them, and I was completely unharmed. They're not aggressive at all. My kids even like to pet the bumblebees in the summer. It's one of the fun things that they like to do. So I want you to love native bees and not have a fear around them. And they have a really important job. They're very effective pollinators of fruits and vegetables, including cherries, apples, squash, watermelons, blueberries, and raspberries, and the list there goes on and on. Excuse me. So I wasn't going to dive into individual species because that's a vast list, but I did just want to highlight the western bumblebee. The reason for that is because it's at a high risk for extinction, and this is a bee found in our region. They are ground dwellers and produce new hives every year. And they're known as a generalist forager, and the bees will visit a wide range of plants like peppers, cranberries, and tomatoes. And I just wanted to let you know, in terms of conservation efforts, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is currently actively working hard to figure out what the habitat needs are for the western bumblebee, what their range is and their distribution for conservation efforts, so they can focus their efforts to kind of protecting the populations that we know about. So native hummingbirds. So we have 4 species of hummingbird in Washington, but 2 of them are found on the west side where we live. So there's the rufous hummingbird and the Anna's hummingbird. I love this picture of this Anna's hummingbird on this pine. They can travel up to 23 miles daily in search of nectar and insects. And they're some of the most efficient pollinators in Washington. And they're specialized pollinators. Some flowers that can only be pollinated by hummingbirds. And one of my favorites, that's a great native plant that you can find at nurseries, is the trumpet honeysuckle. I'm going to try to intersperse a lot of native plant species throughout this talk to just kind of give you ideas to start thinking about for potentially your own projects. Oh, another thing I was going to mention about the native hummingbird is if you feed your hummingbirds with bird feeder or hummingbird feeders, the Anna's hummingbird has actually changed its migration and stopped migrating in the winter because they've adapted to us feeding them. And so if you have your hummingbird feeder out, make sure you keep it out all year long, especially in the winter time, because they're reliant on that nectar source. Native butterflies. There's 154 species in Washington. Their larvae in particular need food plants, which include many of our native deciduous and coniferous trees. And one example here is our beautiful tiger swallowtail. They are large and their colors and petals resemble tigers. So I have a fun pop quiz here, some Jeopardy facts for you. If you feel brave or think you have a good guess, feel free in the chat to take a pic of what you think a group of butterflies is called. Is it a pandemonium, a dazzle, a kaleidoscope, or a murder? I'll give you a few seconds to take a guess. And if folks are putting it in the chat, Madeline can let me know if there's a consensus on the thought of what the term is.
I'm seeing a lot of C's,
Mm,
but we're getting a wide variety of guesses. But
okay.
I want to say C is the most popular guess right now.
Okay, well then I'm very impressed with the group because C is the correct answer. It's kaleidoscope, which I think is a very cute fact about butterflies, so I couldn't help but share in this presentation. Zebras are called a dazzle really quick, and a group of cows is called a murder, and then a group of parrots is called a pandemonium. So fun fact for the day. Pollinating flies or flower flies or hoverflies are also another species in our area. They're bee impersonating flies. A WSU study found that 35% of visits to flowers in urban and rural locations were from flower flies. And they're often specialized foragers visiting plants that other pollinators are unable to access. And they're also excellent pest control because they feed on aphids and scale pests. One thing we're going to talk about is monarchs. I just want to touch on them for a second because I know they're kind of the poster child for pollinator conservation. And I just didn't want you to think we overlook them for this talk, but they're not really currently in Western Washington. The population's currently east of the Cascades where there's large milkweed populations, which is the plant that they've co-evolved with. And they do have a migration route through Washington and south, mostly concentrating along the river courses of the Columbia and Snake Rivers. Excuse me. So there's a lot of facts that are going around. Like I get spammed with a lot of facts about pollinators that are very dire and like Facebook and things like that. But I rely on the Xerxes Society. They're kind of our expert for all things pollinator related. And so this is their current statistics about the current rate of decline with pollinators. So 50% of leafcutter bees and 20% of mason bees are in decline, 19% of butterflies, 28% of bumblebee species. Beekeepers are losing more than 30% of their honeybee hives. And then 27 species of non-native lady beetles have established and are threatening species. I also just wanted to really differentiate for a moment the difference between the European honeybee and native pollinators. So the European honeybee were brought over here in the 1600s for honey and beeswax production, and then have made it into the natural environment. But we now also heavily rely on them for large-scale crop production. And so they're also essential pollinators for our area, but they can also compete with native bees. And research has found that the competition is particularly fierce in residential gardens where there's a lower proportion of native wildflowers that our native bees have co-evolved with to forage on. So we know European honeybees, which is a broader term for all the subspecies of European bees that exist for pollinators. They're not going to be a focus of this talk today, but they do have an important role in our food production. So moving into food production, pollinator impact. There's a saying that every third bite that you eat depends on bees. So they produce 1/3 of our diet, and they're credited with producing over $27 billion a year in the US and $210 billion worldwide with the food production that they produce. So they're super important, and they are facing several risks. Just to make you aware, so like global risks to pollinators include habitat loss, because many pollinators are specialized species that require a high amount of biodiversity and habitat to support healthy populations. And with habitat loss, the biodiversity of native plants is reduced, limiting food resources. And going along with habitat loss, when species are forced into smaller habitat zones, there's a higher risk of spreading disease and infection between individual populations. Parasites and pathogens, you may have heard of colony collapse with the honeybees. Varroa mites can really devastate native bee populations. The misuse of pesticide, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the talk, but spraying pesticide while the bees are active or spraying it on pollinator plants while they're active can be totally devastating to a native bee population. And then climate change has been impacting pollinators, particularly because the rising temperatures, like bloom times of plants, are happening earlier in the year, and that's reducing a lot of the late plant species being available for when the pollinators depend on them, like in the fall. So moving into the more fun part of the talk, we're kind of jump into the creating pollinator habitat. So first thing I thought, I very intentionally picked this photo for this slide. And you might be scratching your head saying like, okay, we're talking about creating pollinator habitat. Where's all the flowers? How could this be pollinator habitat? Well, that's one of the big things I wanted to stress in this presentation, is that creating pollinator habitat for our native species is a lot more than just the flowers and the wildflower meadows that we kind of associate with our pollinators. And so we're going to kind of talk more about that now. And so our native pollinators have evolved with our forest systems. So if you think about it, Western Washington historically was primarily forested. And that's what our bees, that's the ecosystem that our pollinators evolved in. And so if you're able to create a healthy forest system by having things that create for ground cover, the shrub layers, the mid layer, and the canopy layer, you're going to be supporting a whole range of pollinators in different life stages. You know, so like, for example, many adult pollinators are ground dwellers where the larvae also reside in the canopy layer. So just starting with the forest floor, you may have heard of the saying, leave the leaves in the fall. A lot of our insects will burrow in the leaves and leave eggs in those leaves for the spring. And so even if you're not able to like leave them across your lawn because you want to preserve that grass, maybe you could rake it over into a pile and leave that undisturbed. And then also leaving brush piles. Brush piles are amazing wildlife habitat in general. So areas of dead wood are really helpful, and the insects will also go in there and nest in ground and overwinter in those brush piles. And then we mentioned how many of our native bees are ground nesting, and so bare areas are really important. I noticed that I have a forested edge next to where I live, and I noticed that the bare areas right on the forested edge are really popular nesting habitat for bees. So bees like the western bumblebee and squash bees and longhorn bees are all ground dwellers using holes in the ground for habitat. And a couple of great native ground cover plants that you could plant are kinnikinnick, orange stonecrop, and beech strawberry. So stinging nettle, I was one of my favorite plants. You probably have a strong negative association with this plant if you've ever brushed up against it, because you have an immediate stinging feeling that can last longer than you'd want it to. So I think people often think of stinging nettle as kind of a nuisance weed, but it's actually a really important pollinator plant. So you can identify it by clustered erect leafy stems with spreading roots and the stinging hairs that we all know that leave that temporary sting on the skin. But they like to grow in moist, deep soils and meadows and forests and shrubby places and thick, but also you can find them in thick patches and disturbed places. They're pretty robust. But they're the exclusive caterpillar host plant. for 3 of our butterflies, including the orange satyr angelwings, Milbert's tortoiseshell, and the red admirals. And all of those butterflies are common in the Seattle area in the spring and fall and overwinter as adults. And then American ladies and painted ladies, excuse me, also use nettles as a larval food. And so I have a lot of stinging nettle next to my house, and I started looking into it because, well, it's also an edible plant. You can make tea with it. But I noticed by midsummer, every single leaf of every single nettle was completely chewed to bits. And so I thought there's something here that loves this. And so when I looked into it, I found out that it's actually really vital for several of our native species of butterfly. So now we're starting to actually talk about flowers. So that's the shrub layer. So that is where the food, most of the food is for our native pollinators. So a couple examples of our lovely shrubs that grow native here are red osier dogwood, red flowering currant, which is the picture in the top corner there. It's actually flowering right now. So if you see it out in areas, you'll probably, if you wait long enough, you'll probably see hummingbirds zinging by and maybe a few bees that have already emerged for the spring. Ocean spray, Nootka rose. Nootka rose is fun because then you can take the rose hips and make tea. Douglas spirea, and Oregon grape is a great one, and the Pacific ninebark. But there's a whole other list, and we're going to follow up with some plant lists also as part of this talk. So I'm just giving you kind of some food for thought for a few species here, but these are not exhaustive lists at all. So then this is my favorite shrub to highlight, which you're probably thinking, wait, this is a vine maple, but it technically is considered a shrub. It's a lush deciduous maple species, and it's a great mid-story plant. You know, we're talking about the forest, the layers of a forest, the different zones of a forest, but it attracts mason bees and bumblebees and is the host plant for the western swallowtail butterfly as larval sites. It also is it creates seeds in the fall, which are a favorite food of songbirds, game birds, and other wildlife. And the reason I picked this as a shrub plant is because if you live in a city or in Seattle, if you have a small lot, this is a great tree that you can plant. It does not take up a lot of space, does not have a huge canopy cover, but it's a great way to diversify the plants that you have growing in your area and create some more pollinator habitat versus just a meadowscape. It kind of is a versatile tree that you could plant anywhere. So I thought it was a good tree there, good shrub to highlight. And these are all pictures that I took next to my house of the vine maple. So then canopy cover, all of our native trees. So when I think of tree canopy cover, I really think of butterflies because butterflies use our native trees as protection and for laying larvae. And many our native trees rely on pollination from bees and butterflies and hummingbirds. So some great trees to plant that promote our pollinators are cascara, Oregon white oak, big leaf maple. Big leaf maple has a ton of value for pollinators. Western hemlock are Douglas firs that are very common, and Pacific madrone. For example, madrone is a larval plant for the Ceanothus silk moth and the brown elfin butterfly, and they're pollinated by spring azure butterflies and bees. So next, I love the cascara tree, so I wanted to highlight that as a great tree that you could plant and promote in an area. It's often confused with red alder because it has somewhat of a similar appearance, but I think it's a frequently overlooked and underappreciated tree. They're small, upright trees, but the flowers attract many pollinators in the early summer, including the gray hairstreak butterflies. Swallowtail butterflies lay their eggs on the leaves. There's more than a dozen moth species that feed on the leaves, and it's a hummingbird favorite for nectar too. And it's also wildfire resistant. So if you live in an area where you're worried about fire risk, this could be a good tree to plant. Okay, so now we're really talking more flowers. So the next thing you want to think about, you could try to think about recreating a forest system, or you can also think about the importance of creating blooms or food resources for every season. So you want to aim for continuous blooms when you're designing pollinator habitat. And ideally, you want to select a variety of plants that will bloom throughout each season. So you want to select at least 3 species that will be blooming during the spring, summer, and the fall. And so we're going to talk about some example plants that you could plant for each season. So some spring examples, I already mentioned kinnikinick as a ground cover, but it's a hardy evergreen ground cover plant, attracting butterflies, beneficial insects, and provides berries for wildlife. Salmonberry is one of my favorites. It's a shrub that blooms early, so it's a good early bloomer, and also provides nesting material for insects. I mentioned red flowering currant earlier, but that's a really great one for an early spring plant because it starts flowering earlier than a lot of others do. It's one of the first to bloom in the spring, and it's also a larval host plant and bumblebee plant. But the earliest bloomer is the osoberry. So that is kind of how I know spring is on the way. It will start flowering in February, and it's also a fruit-bearing plant. So I already mentioned it's one of the earliest plants to bloom. I'm trying to remember, I think the osoberry at my house started blooming the end of February this year, and it provides a nectar source for hummingbirds, bees, and butterflies. So then jumping into summer, there's a huge long list of shrubs and flowering plants that bloom in the summer. But just a couple examples are the Pacific ninebark. It has beautiful white flowers that bloom in late spring. Serviceberry is a large flowering shrub with edible fruit. It's also deer resistant. And then Douglas spirea does great in really wet areas and wetlands, but it's a flowering shrub that blooms midsummer and attracts bees and beneficial insects. And then Nooka rose again provides nesting material and nestites and supports bumblebee and is a larval host plant too. And then fall examples. The fall is where we're the most limited. There's the fewest variety of plants that you can plant that provide food resources for the fall. But a few that we have in our area are aspen fleabane, which is a really pretty deer-resistant perennial flower that supports specialist bees. So that's important. It also promotes specialists and is a larval host plant. And then pearly everlasting, kind of more of a tall, lanky perennial that blooms late into the year and is a host plant for the painted ladies and American ladies, which are butterflies. And then fireweed. Fireweed is a really robust perennial wildflower that likes full sun. And it's a larval host plant and supports beneficial insects, bumblebees, also provides nesting material. And if you're ever lucky enough to be somewhere that sells wildfire fireweed honey, I suggest you should sample it because it's amazing. All right, so moving ahead. So Madeline actually created this amazing graphic that we have that shows you the different species that you could think of planting for your early season blooms, mid-season, and late season, or spring, summer, fall, essentially. And then also, things that cover ground cover, shrubs, and trees. So they're also kind of recreating like a forest system. So you can maximize their benefit to pollinators in either direction. And we can also share this graphic out with folks, I think, if folks were interested, because I think this is super helpful. Okay. So from there, so I also wanted to highlight a couple of my favorite plants, which are one being, I'm going to play a video while I'm talking, one being the Douglas aster. I call it powerhouse perennial because research studies have found that it attracts the highest variety and abundance of bees. So one great study from Oregon is about native plant picks for bees, 100 species you can grow to support wild bees in Oregon, which are also species that are great in Washington for the most part. But they found basically that Douglas aster, you're going to have the highest number of bees coming and the most different species of bees coming. And they're also great because they provide summer and late season blooms, and they have a long blooming period. And it also attracts butterflies and moth larvae. So you get a lot of bang for your buck with Douglas asters. And then Canada goldenrod, excuse me, it's kind of my runner-up. I call it my honorable mention for a really high value pollinator plant. Not to be confused with ragweed because it looks somewhat similar, but very different. It doesn't actually have any airborne pollen that's going to make your eyes water and make you feel like you have to sneeze. Another herbaceous perennial wildflower, and it attracts another almost as high variety and abundance of bees as Douglas aster, but just short of Douglas aster in terms of its impact. But it's a really good late summer, fall food resource. Like Canada goldenrod will keep flowering. Well, let's see, at my house, I had flowers on my goldenrod until November last year. And then the Xerxes Society had a really interesting study done on their publication related to farming for bees that found that bumblebee queen survival is dependent on the amount of fall forage resources, and that goldenrod and aster, when planted together, they were able to feed on that, and it really helps fatten up queens in the fall so they can go into hibernation in really good shape for survival. So I just can't say enough about these two plants. And then there's a lot of different goldenrod species. So if you were looking into planting this, you'd want the Solidago canadensis, the Latin name, you'd want that variety if you want to be putting a native one in. So I did want to mention there are some superstar non-native plants for pollinators. I know this is mostly a native plant talk, but in that same study that I referenced that OSU did, Russian sage was in the top 5 for high value pollinator plants. It thrives in dry, arid environments. If you go to the high desert in Oregon, you will see a massive Russian sages planted everywhere with just covered in bees. But they also attract a high number of variety and species abundance of pollinators. California poppy, I call native adjacent because it is native in the lower reaches of Washington, but its range kind of ends in Vancouver. But it also likes droughty conditions, but it's just a gorgeous little orange flower that's really hardy and just bees go nuts for it. And then Mexican sunflower also, or any kind of sunflower really, but Mexican sunflower in particular is another great non-native or native adjacent that you can plant that has really high value for bees. And so the inverse of that, I just wanted to make people aware that just because you see flowers on a plant, that might not actually have any value for pollinators. So the real infamous one is butterfly bush, because the name is super confusing, because it inherently sounds like it would be great for pollinators, and they get huge and beautiful, but not a single native caterpillar in North America can feed on a butterfly bush. So there's major irony there. And it also can escape into natural areas and crowd out native plants. So it always breaks my heart when I have to go to a property and they see a native butterfly or a butterfly bush in their garden, and I have to let them know that they could probably replace it with something else if they wanted something that won't escape into our wetlands, particularly. Hydrangea, they look like they'd be heaven for bees, right? They have those big, huge, beautiful clusters of flowers. But all the flowers are sterile and don't actually have any pollen or nectar. Don't go cutting your hydrangeas down. It's totally okay to have like our beautiful ornamental plants. But they're just know that you're not actually helping our pollinators provide any food resources. Lavender. So this is from the Xerxes Society. Like their researchers have let us know that lavender actually doesn't really attract that many species of bees. So most of the species that you see are either honeybees or the common yellow-faced bumblebee. So with that said, like if you look at your lavender plants, yes, there's absolutely going to be bees all over them, but there's not a huge variety. It's pretty limited with lavender. So their impact is kind of constrained or limited. But the bees that do go will do a great job pollinating them for you. So we're just going to run through some more additional tips. So another thing to think about with our pollinators is water. So just like other wildlife, pollinators need water resources to drink, and I need to add a D there, and cool their nests. So one thing we want to talk about is considering adding bird baths and ponds. Also mud puddles for minerals, especially for butterflies. Have you ever seen just a whole cluster of butterflies around a mud puddle somewhere? They're kind of trying to take advantage of the minerals in the ground. So this picture is actually from my manager Carrie's house next to her pollinator plants. This is the water dish that she's created, but you can create an insect watering dish. So the key is to get a shallow dish and then place a variety of stones of different sizes in it, and then fill the dish with about 1 inch of water so that bees can come and drink but not fall in. They have a way of getting out. So the stones allowed insects and small birds to land and drink safely. And then you also just want to make sure that you drain it completely and replace the water every 2 to 3 days to kind of keep it clean. But also important thing to consider. Another thing you might want to think about if you have domestic cats that are frequent in your yard, in your area, you can, there's dishes that you can like hang from trees and things. And that way, if you elevate it, cats that are outside are not going to be able to take advantage of the birds that are attracted to the water for predation. So farming for bees, this is a thing I talk with folks a lot about just in my job. I'm helping our rural cooperators in King County. But there's a lot of different ways that when in a farming or agriculture environment that you can help promote them. So one thing you can do is plant a pollinator hedgerow, like along your garden or along your cropland, because then that pollinator hedgerow is going to attract the insects and the creatures that you want to come that will also pollinate your vegetable crops. So it's like a win-win. Another thing we talk a lot about, mostly for soil health. So if you come to our soil health talk, we have a whole slide about cover crops and the value for soil health. But several cover crop varieties also provide great food resources for pollinators. My favorite being crimson clover. So in my garden, in between my vegetables, after my vegetable crops have established enough, I then plant crimson clover seed in there. And then it blooms during the summer. And it's also a beautiful red bloom. And then it's attracting more pollinators to my garden. Another thing you can do is like fall cover crops. So fall cover crops in your garden will also give you many soil health benefits. But then if you plant them early enough and they're able to flower, then you're also having dual benefits there. Some things like forage radish, for example, I plant let flower, and it's a great attractant for pollinators. Another thing you can do is leave untilled areas, going back to how most of our species pollinators are ground nesting, the bees, so that way they have a place to burrow that's not disturbed. Another thing you can think about just in general with gardening and doing yard work is to try not to start your gardening or tilling your soil or turning your soil up until later in the spring. So that way you're letting all of the ground nesters emerge before you're then disturbing the soil. And then another thing you can do is reduce herbicide and insecticide use and spray when bees are not active, usually 1 hour after dusk. And since I think I'm doing okay on time, I can share a personal story about insecticide use or herbicide use, and then kind of make you think about how there's different ways of approaching pest issues. So last year, I tend to have a bad habit of impulse buying at plant nurseries, and I bought an ornamental plant for my front yard that I did not know was infested with an aphid pest, and that then moved into my rhododendrons and was killing my rhododendrons off, which I had Douglas aster and goldenrod planted all around those plants. And so all the research said in order to control this aphid, I should integrate a neonicotinoid herbicide into the soil around those trees or around the bushes. And then the plants would uptake that herbicide and then become lethal for any insects on the plant. So if I had taken those instructions and integrated that herbicide into the soil, my Douglas aster and goldenrod would have taken it up into their plant matter and then become beautiful, alluring lethal pollinator plants to all of the bees and moths and butterflies that come visit those plants throughout the summer. So I said, okay, that's not an option. And I ended up just defoliating all the rhododendrons, throwing all of the infested leaves away, and then they came back fine. So I was able to kind of do more research and figure out an alternative method than having to use herbicide that was going to potentially kill a whole lot of innocent pollinators while I'm trying to control this aphid pest. So it's just for different ways of thinking about it. You can consult with master gardeners. They're a great resource for pest issues and things like that too. Just kind of thinking a little more, being a little more intentional when you need to use an herbicide or insecticide. And even researching things like neem oils, which claim to be kind of pollinator safe. It's not necessarily the case. So maybe that's more of a case of you're applying it, but maybe just when their pollinators are not active, like maybe in the evening. So then another thing I love to do is letting your herbs bolt. That's usually because I don't get to my herbs fast enough and they bolt before I can harvest them. But I noticed that those herbs, like especially dill, chives, cilantro, and catnip is a big one. They all really attract bees and pollinators. So maybe one thing you can do is harvest the amount that you want for yourself. And then maybe towards the end of the season, you could just let them go bolt and then let the bees have at them. So bee boxes. I wanted to address this because this is a common thing. You can go to any plant nursery store and you're going to might see bee boxes for sale. And so I wanted to kind of create a slide of like to bee box or not to bee box. So what bee boxes are like in this picture that's shown there, they're typically made of a bunch of paper or cardboard tubes aligned in a box. And they're made to attract primarily mason bees because mason bees are superstar pollinators. Like if you want to attract them to your garden or whatever you're trying to grow, you want to attract mason bees because they're do such an amazing job. So the benefits is that they're providing an immediate huge abundance of nest sites because mason bees are cavity dwellers, also leafcutter bees as well. And then you can also relocate or introduce new individuals very easily with a bee box. Or you can take the eggs, put them in your fridge all winter long, and then put them back out to hatch. And then you can keep the mason bee populations going in your area. And there's also a small chance of accidentally hurting the pollinators. But the cons is that there's a high risk of disease from the tubes. I find that they really attract predators like mites, but you have to replace the tubes every year. So I think it's the kind of thing like they're definitely fun to use, but they need management. They're not kind of something you can just put up and then walk away from. You want to make sure that mites haven't become infesting the tubes, and yeah, that they're clean. So I'm not pro or against. I just say you want to go into it with all the information. So this is fun. We get to share some pollinator habitat projects to kind of help inspire you, maybe to create your own habitat at your home. And these are all pictures that are from King County, I'm pretty sure. We had one this cooperator, Chris Fuentes, who allowed us to use these photos of his project. So this is his home. And he did a really great job documenting his process of converting his lawn into pollinator habitat. And he created a meadowscape. So meadowscaping, so I know not everyone can recreate a forest system where they live. Like that's a tall ask. You need a lot of space for that. It takes a lot of time. But a great thing you can do in any size area is creating a meadow. And that's usually with like perennial wildflowers and annuals and lower growing plants. And so, yeah, so this is a start. In 2020, he started sheet mulching. So he covered it up with cardboard and then put mulch over that to kill off the grass and all the weeds and everything that was growing there to kind of have a starting place for planting. And I didn't include all of his slides, but I wanted to skip to the completed project part so I had time to share some other projects. But this is what it looked like. He put in a huge variety of plants. And he also created, I didn't have the photo, but he also created a really cool little stream that meandered through it to provide water also for all the pollinators. And so here's just some photos that he shared of the plants and then the pollinators coming to them. And like you can see right in the middle, that hummingbird loves red flowering currant. So they're all over red flowering currant this time of year right now. And so this is my coworker Matt Maria's yard in Tacoma. So he also loves all things pollinators. And so when he moved to his house, he converted his lawn into this amazing pollinator habitat. So this is another example of a meadowscape that's mature and looks really great. And then this is my manager Carrie's front yard in Auburn. People are regularly stop and try to talk to her about how amazing and impressive her front yard looks, but she also converted her front yard into this really beautiful, colorful pollinator meadowscape with a huge variety of flowers. Excuse me. So I also just wanted to show you if you did have the space and really wanted to create more of a native forest landscape, One of my favorite native shrub hedgerows is at Seuss Creek Park in Kent. And if you walk along the path there, the Parks Department did a great job planting all of the native shrubs along the forest edge there. And so these aren't the best photos. It was really hard for me to capture the details of the shrub. You can see all the shrubs there. There is ocean spray, salmonberry, Nootka rose all over in there, Oregon grape, and they're all just thriving. So that's what a native shrub hedgerow would look like, just to give you a sense of the size and scale of one. And then you can see the red flower and currant that they have that was in full bloom when I took the photos. So then I just wanted to follow up with additional resources for learning more about pollinators. We have a KCD plant sale every year. We just had our plant pickup a few weeks ago, but every year starting in November, you can go onto our website and you can order low-cost bundles of native plants, including a lot of pollinator plants, like Douglas aster is one of those, a lot of our shrubs. And you can then pick up the plants in early March. And they're bare root plants, so you want to get them into the ground as quick as possible. And we have a pretty good survival success rate with our plants. And you can find all that information on our website there. So it's a great way to get large volumes of low-cost plants. And we don't really make any profit off of the plant sale. The real goal of it is just to be able to get as many native plants out into the community as we can. So, and there's no limit, minimum or maximum to the amount of plants you could buy. Other than that, we sell out really quickly. So if you really want to get native plants and take advantage of our plant sale, just make sure you get your order in with the first week or two, because it's gotten very popular in the last few years. Another resource that we have, and we're going to share a link to this in the follow-up email, is our interactive step-by-step guide to native planting. So I know in this presentation, I threw a lot of different species out at you to think about in terms of creating native habitat for pollinators. And that's kind of just a starting place. And then if you want to deep dive into that, or you want to try to design your own native planting, you can walk through this module on your own pace and timing to kind of learn about which plants prefer wet areas versus dry or sun and shade. Like, it walks you through all of that kind of to help you go even further with trying to design something for pollinators. And Madeline can also talk about that a little more after this too, and then she also gives another talk about native plants as well. So there's other talks to kind of deep dive even more into like recreating native habitat beyond this talk, so you can kind of continue with your journey through our services. I mentioned the Xerces Society, and they have their Xerces Society website link is up there. That is where you can find vast amounts of information about pollinators. Here's a few of their books here. I have two of their favorites here. This is the Gardening for Butterflies, and I have their Attracting Native Pollinators book. This one will have information about all the different species of bees, all the different situations where you could create habitat, how to create habitat, like step by step for that. Lots of detail about all the different flowers and plants that you can use for creating pollinators. And so actually one of the reasons I created this talk was because the Xerces Society has so much information, but I found it kind of overwhelming to wade through. It does have regional specific information too, so you can go to like our Pacific Northwest region for information, but even that is quite vast. And so I kind of wanted to distill all of that information to kind of more of an overall starting place for people, so you don't feel overwhelmed just starting to learn about pollinators and recreating pollinator habitat. But I would definitely recommend their books. They're a nonprofit organization. They also have technical experts that can give you more help and ideas about how to get started on doing any kind of pollinator projects. Yeah, they're just vast resource, and also always very helpful. Sometimes they come to our office, they give our staff talks about pollinators. So I can't say enough good things about the Xerces Society. So we talked about KCD at the start of this talk, and we just wanted to talk a little bit more about all of the services we offer. As I mentioned earlier, we're kind of spread through word of mouth and sort of like a hidden resource in a lot of cases. But I definitely recommend you again to go on our website or check out the conservation district in your county. We have a soil nutrient testing program. So every parcel in King County is eligible for 5 free soil tests with us. And then if you use up your 5 free soil tests, additional ones are $40. But we can also provide, and it's on our website, how to take a soil test and how to send the sample in. Now, right before we're doing all of our spring gardening, now is a great time to take a soil test and see what nutrients your soil needs back. If you wanted to take even more of a deep dive into soil nutrient knowledge, we offer a few times every year, we offer a soil health talk. Me and my coworker Jay usually present that. I already mentioned our native plant sale, but we also have lots of other educational and volunteer programs. You can come volunteer at our native plant nursery. And sometimes if you do a few volunteer hours there, sometimes you can become eligible for a few free native plants. We have a shoreline and riparian habitat enhancement and conservation reserve enhancement program. Essentially, that's a mouthful. We call that our riparian program. So they help implement habitat restoration along all of our streams and rivers, which are highly polluted. And so we do a lot of great work to create native habitat along those rivers, stabilize the banks, try to keep pollution out of the water, shade the water for salmon because salmon need really cool water to thrive. And our native forests do a great job. And also having native habitat along streams puts more habitat into the aquatic areas too, provides habitat for aquatic areas. We also have a forest health program and a wildfire resiliency program. So if you want someone to come out and talk to you about forest health, look at your forest and see if they see any issues, help with forest restoration. If you're wanting to know more about wildfire resiliency, which is becoming more and more of kind of a relevant, urgent need in our area, you can reach out to that program. Miranda's here, but Miranda manages our community agriculture program, and she helps establish community gardens in all different parts of King County. So then we have the farm program, agricultural drainage program. We have rental programs. We have a tool rental program for community ag. We have all kinds of equipment for farms. And then we have some grant programs that supply funding for our regional food system. There's a cost share program where we help fund things for rural cooperators, member jurisdiction grant. So we have all kinds of resources that are available to the public. And I just wanted to let you know about them so that you know that they're out there. Or maybe your neighbor has a forest and maybe your neighbor could use some help, so you can refer them to us. So keep spreading the word about the conservation district. Yeah, so with that, final thoughts thinking about our native pollinators is just consider, making a variety of choices that cover, ground cover, shrubs, trees. Maybe you could fit a little vine maple in your backyard. And then you want to include plants that are going to be blooming or providing food, across the seasons, across spring, summer, and fall. Rethink manicured yard and gardens. Wildflowers are kind of messy. Native plants often look weedy. And so if you're going to kind of embrace meadowscaping or natural habitat, it's not going to quite have that refined look as a yard, but it's going to be doing a lot of value for our ecosystem. And then just once again, careful use of herbicide and pesticide. Yeah, so with that, thanks so much for everyone coming today. It was really a pleasure to get to present to you all. And you're welcome to reach out to me. So that's my contact information. You're welcome to email me with other questions, or there's plenty of time to ask questions today. But if you have an additional question you think of later, feel free to reach out. Happy to always chat about pollinators.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. We definitely had an active chat and some good questions. Feel free, everybody, if you think of questions as we're doing the Q&A, feel free to put them in the chat. But I will go ahead and start with our first one. From Stinette. about the water dishes for pollinators. Is it better to have those in the sun or the shade? Does it make a
Oh,
difference?
good question. I would definitely keep them in the shade to keep the water cool because those dishes can actually get really hot in the direct sun. So that's a great question. Yeah. So ideally, if you can shade it, if not, it's better to have water versus no water. But yeah, that's a great question to help keep it a little cooler.
All right, great. And then we had a comment from Anthony that made me do a quick Google that oak leaf hydrangea is a good pollinator plant. And then when I was looking up hydrangeas and pollinators, it looks like there are some like native hydrangeas, like wild hydrangeas that are good for pollinators. And then a lot of what we're seeing in people's yards, like really beautiful, like purple and pink and blue hydrangeas are like cultivars
Mm-hmm.
bred for landscaping, and those ones, yeah, do not have any pollen. So kind of interesting plant breeding going on there.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't know. That's interesting. I didn't know there was somewhere there had a region of native hydrangeas.
yeah, the
Mhm.
one Anthony called out was the oak leaf hydrangea, which I did when I looked it up, and I'll share pictures of it in the email tomorrow in case people want to see it. It does look a little different than the ones I think we all think about when we hear hydrangeas.
This is a good point, though. I think that kind of goes back to my point too. I kind of mentioned this briefly with goldenrod, but be careful of the actual. Not all, like there's a lot of different varieties of plants, so just make sure when you're looking into like a honeysuckle, for example, you might accidentally buy. You think you're buying trumpet honeysuckle, but you want to check the Latin. That's key, so you know that you're buying one of the native plants that are beneficial.
And then next question from Ben, are there any grass or lawn adjacent seed blends or plants that you recommend working into lawns or meadows to make them more pollinator or insect promoting?
Yeah, well, if you don't feel like you want to take on a full-on meadowscape, but you have a lawn, clover, like especially like white clover or red clover, that's a great thing to add to a lawn mix because that will flower and that's great for bees too. So that's it. It'll mostly attract honeybees, but native bees will still use our clover variety. So I hopefully is that hopefully that's the answering part of the question or
Yeah, and then I can also share out links to there's a couple local businesses that sell, I
Mhm.
think, like ready-made mixes that are
Mm,
like local pollinator mixes.
excuse me.
Mhm. And then another question about lawns. If we have some grass lawn, should we not mow until the summer, such as no mow May? Is no mow May a real thing for pollinators?
That I have not heard of. I like it. Um, I mean, in general, letting grass be a little bit taller is better for habitat and better for soil health in general. Um, yeah, that's a hard one because there's the aesthetic component of mowing. Um, I let my lawn get really long in areas where I have pollinator plants that pop up. I drive my husband crazy because it's like a maze trying to mow my lawn because there's all these patches that I've forbidden him to mow over. But I don't know how to look into that. I like the concept. I like the idea of May.
Sorry, I got muted. Yeah, muted. I've heard of low mow May to
Mm.
give flowering to bloom so that they can actually help pollinators.
I find
Um,
one issue with that, like in my art in particular, I have a lot of creeping buttercup, which is a common invasive weed in our lawn. The problem is if I let it go too long, then I'm giving the creeping buttercup the advantage. I don't want it to flower. So there's challenges around that, but I like the concept of it for sure. Yeah, I think it's kind of probably site dependent.
yeah, I definitely need to consider weeds.
Mhm.
Okay. And then Megan, I'm going to give you a heads up that I emailed this question to Jackie because it sounded right up her alley. But we have a participant from Red Deer, Alberta, which is pretty
Mm.
far north. And do you have any tips for plant ideas for this area?
I'm very grateful you asked Jackie. Jackie works for the conservation district, but she is our Canadian representative. And she's also has a master's in botany and is an expert in all things plant. So I would have definitely deferred to her. So did Jackie have an answer?
I haven't heard back from her yet, but
Okay.
my guess is that I'll be able to give you some more information tomorrow in the email. We had someone from Edmonton in the chat mentioning some plants that they like for that area too. So I think we
Okay.
can get some answers for this person.
I would also, that's where also the Xerxes Society comes in. I would definitely reach out to them and their experts, and see if they had opinions on that.
All right. We keep getting more questions. All
Mhm.
right. Um, do we have any pollinator habitat funding for landowners for through us or through NRCS?
Great question. We don't really currently have it through us, unless you're thinking about the sense of like when we do our shoreline restoration projects or forest restoration projects, there's a lot of pollinator plants that we're planting in those situations. But in terms of like meadowscaping and things like that, we don't currently, but our federal partners do. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a mouthful, but they're an agency housed under the USDA. And I call them like our sister brother agency. We work together a lot. And they have a long list of things that they can fund. And conservation cover is their technical term for it, but they can help fund pollinator planting. So I would definitely reach out. We have a local Renton office for King County, but you could reach out to our local representative there and talk to them about options.
And Megan, I'm guessing
Mhm.
most of that would not be for like someone wanting to do a pollinator project in their backyard, but more for farmers and other larger landowners.
They do have an urban programs, but I'm not sure
Yeah.
and they have told me, I've asked them that exact question before, and they have told me there are options for that. Um, I do have a dream that everyone's heard me at KCD rant about over the years that one day I want to create funding for this specifically for small spaces, but we don't have that currently in house. Mhm. We
And
do give
also,
out wildflower packets though. So if you come find us at the event, we're often giving out wildflower packets. Mhm.
yeah, and I'll include links to NRCS's various programs in the
Mhm,
follow-up
mhm,
email
mhm.
also. And then I would say this isn't funding, but I did mention in the chat if you're just looking for native plants, in addition to our plant sale, you can earn free native plants by volunteering at our nursery. And those actually are just like really nice potted plants. So that is one option if you're sourcing plants and you'd like some help there. And then, okay, regarding all of the beautiful examples of yards you showed, can people, I guess this is probably a question for Matt and Carrie, if we are allowed to share their
Uh,
address so people can go view those projects. You can definitely go to Sioux Creek Park because that's a public space.
yeah, it's a good question. We could ask them if they don't mind. I bet you my manager Carrie does not mind. She lives on a very main part of Auburn, and I'll ask her. And I think she'd be more than happy for people to drive by. And I'll don't tell her I said this, but like honk, say like go pollinators when you drive by her house. Mhm.
And then April's looking for some advice on Nootka Rose. I love Nootka Rose, but mine are just taking over, which they definitely do, sending runners underground and wanting to grow into a thicket. It's hard to deal with these big thorny plants, though I love the blossoms and rose hips.
Yeah, that is the one thing with our native shrubs is they are great at creating big thickets and masses, especially if they're in conditions that they're really favorable for them. If you walk along Sioux Creek Park, you'll see huge thickets of Nootka rose. But our shrubs can take a good pruning back. And so don't be afraid to heavily prune them back and kind of try to keep them controlled. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of other ways to contain them, other than like heavily, I have to do that along my house. Every year, like the salmonberry just completely takes over and becomes obnoxious, and so I'm just regularly pruning it down. In a lot of cases, it kind of like invigorates regrowth and fresh new growth. I don't know, Madeline, do you have any thoughts?
I've seen people like if it's growing against like up to the border of a lawn and it will start to send those runners out into the lawn. I've seen people like just mow to keep it contained to an area. You could, this isn't really like something you could do after the fact, but like how people plant bamboo with the kind of containing wall underground. Um,
Mhm.
you could do that. Yeah, if you're like, this isn't helpful if you already have it, but I think if you're planning a planting project, knowing that this is something that Nooka Rose is going to do is really helpful. And if it's not a good spot for it
Mhm.
because of that thicket forming.
Yeah. Do you like Madeline, when you do your native plant talk, do you cover like I don't know, it'd be nice like red flowering currant, like I'm thinking like a replacement plant for Nooka Rose. Red flowering currant doesn't get necessarily really huge, and you can trim it and kind of keep it in like a bushy form. And it's a lot more manageable. So I don't know if we really talk like the difference, in like biomass. I'll
Yeah.
just say it this way.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think we often talk about Nooka Rose as like,
Mhm.
and we also got a question about how to deal with blackberry. And like Nooka Rose is a great one if you've put all that effort into
Mhm.
removing the blackberry, putting something like Nooka Rose in that will form that thicket helps keep the blackberry out. So yeah, I think pruning it, mowing it to kind of keep it contained are definitely both good options. And then as much as you can appreciate also. It sounds like you already do appreciate everything it does for you, but yeah, it's doing a great job of excluding weeds.
Mhm.
Um, yes, and then that does lead us into the question of how do you deal with blackberries, and I think we can talk about it for a second, and I will also share out all of our weed resources.
Yeah, yeah. Blackberries, the bane of, yeah, living in the Pacific Northwest. Um, don't love blackberry for a couple reasons. Just so for folks, for knowledge for everyone, blackberry is uh the full name is Himalayan blackberry. It's not originally from our area. And it's quite good at taking over edges and in forest systems and pretty much everywhere. And creates a ton of biomass that's full of thorns, and creates delicious berries, but it's not very good at stabilizing soil or anything. And so it doesn't have a whole lot of use. Bees will be attracted to it. I've noticed like it's mostly honeybees that are usually all over, but native bees will go to blackberry too. But it's not ideal and it will crowd out everything around it, as I'm sure you've all seen. So it takes over and creates a monoculture, which is not ideal. We talked a lot about creating a diverse habitat, so blackberry is not ideal for that either. And so you can, depending on the size of the thicket, how much time you have, like you can cut it back, you can pull out the root balls, you can spray it. We defer to King County's noxious weed program for all of their recommendations. They're kind of the expert on weed control. You can, I was just talking to a farmer earlier today about how he's going to brush hog it down every year to get it to just kind of give up trying to use its energy reserves to keep coming back along his creek. And then he's going to plant. And so once you get rid of it, coming back to our native plants, what you can do is then plant native plants kind of densely in that area. And as they mature and grow, they will provide so much shade in that area that blackberry won't really be able to outcompete them because our invasive plants don't like shade. And so that's a great way to create a native hedgerow that keeps the weeds out. So when we do like our restoration projects, we do really dense plantings for that reason, so that when we walk away from them, there's a lower likelihood of like plants like blackberry like reinfesting those areas.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will definitely
Mhm.
share out weed resources. We have
Mhm.
many. Um, Okay, Cassie bought a some seeds that were labeled Pacific Northwest Wildflower Mix, but it is from California.
Mm.
Does this matter?
You know, that's a good point. I didn't talk about this. Maybe I'll add this to this talk actually. I would heavily encourage to always read the actual seed species on a seed packet because sometimes they're labeled something that sounds really enticing, but then when you actually read the seeds that what you're planting, um, maybe it's not ideal for what your goal was. I mean, that's okay. You can, I'm sure there's great flowers in there that provide pollinator value, and there's a lot of non-native plants that are great, like going blank on the like bee balm and things like that that bees are attracted to. So I would just, look at the species that are listed on there and see if, it fits for what your goals are. So it kind of depends. But that's interesting. That's from California. Mhm.
And we
Mhm.
do have wildflower seed mixes that
Mhm.
we made sure are all Western Washington native flowering plants. So if you're ever at an event that we're at, or that we're hosting, or that we're tabling at, or if you just want to come by our office in Renton, we can definitely give you some native wildflower seed packets. Um, and then related to that, we got the question, are the plants that grow in the lawn something that bees find beneficial?
In general, a typical lawn, not really. It's really not providing a whole lot of pollinator or insect habitat. And they're also usually heavily managed and mowed, and so that's also a limiting factor. So not so much, unfortunately. Our lawns are the largest crop in the country, but they don't provide a whole lot of resource for most wildlife.
And I think we already got asked about where to find plants that will be beneficial in your lawn, and so I will share out
Yeah,
those resources.
that and clover is like a great, easy, low growing plant that like integrates well with lawn. So
And yeah, the other
mhm.
related question in here is if we know of any seed companies for things like crimson clover, Canada goldenrod, Douglas aster, or other native flowers.
I was trying to remember the other day, and I will find this for and send it to Madeline. But there's somewhere that lists all the local nurseries that have native plant stock, and I cannot remember where I saw it, but it exists somewhere. So I could send that out.
I know where that
Um,
is. I can send that
okay.
out. Yeah. And
Um,
I think specifically for like flowering plant
mm,
seeds, the one I've heard of is not a nursery but a seed company is Northwest Meadowscapes.
mhm.
And I can yeah, I think there are a couple others that I'll send out.
Yeah, and I'm not advocating for a specific store or anything, but I know like if you go to like McClendon's even, you can get bags of crimson clover, So there's some like a local, you'd be surprised at like how much your local nurse plant might have as well. Mhm.
And then I think our last question, but feel free if this isn't the last question, if you have other thoughts, put them in the chat. Um, Regarding pesticides and herbicides, if rat poison was introduced to my garden next to the root system of a flowering plant, uh, is that going to be a problem for pollinators?
That
Or
is a really interesting question. I'm going to have to research that because I don't know what is in rat poison. But that could be a good master gardener question potentially. You can go onto their website and submit questions, or they're often at like farmers markets and things like that. Like that's where I corner them at my farmers market when I have a plant question. I do not know, and I'm sorry I don't know the answer to that. But we can try to look into it potentially.
yeah, the thing
Mhm.
I've heard of is like when pesticides are sprayed directly onto the plant, it can definitely make the flowers
Mhm.
not safe for the pollinators visiting them, but the roots is something that I don't know about, and I don't know like rat poison is presumably for mammals, and
Mhm.
these are not mammals. But
Mhm.
yeah, we'll do some research.
It's a good question. Mhm.
Yeah. Um, all right. Well, yeah, thank you everyone for coming and asking such great questions and providing your own knowledge and experience in the chat. And look out for those emails from me with resource links, some additional answers to questions that we need to find out more information on. And then also I will send out the recording in a few days so that you can review it. Thank you so much to Megan for presenting and Miranda for helping me out. And I hope everyone has a great night.